I'm Ralph Ringenberg, and Henry Ringenberg was my father. Henry was born on November 17th, 1888, and he was born on a farm about 3 miles west of Harlan, Indiana. That's northeast of Fort Wayne, on a farm that at the time they called the Graber Farm. It's on the Page Road. I'm not sure where he went to school. I even asked my brother and I asked my sister, and none of us know exactly where he went to school, but obviously it was probably one of the one-room schools that was in our township, Springfield Township. And he went to that school. He didn't go to high school. He went through probably the 7th or 8th grade. Well, when he was about 13 or 14, the family moved off of that farm on the Page Road, and my grandfather bought a farm about 3 miles east of Harlan, 3 3/4 miles east of Harlan. And so the rest of his growing up days were on that farm east of Harlan. That's an interesting question. I even asked my brother and asked my sister about whether we heard any stories. And my parents were just not the type of people that would tell much about their childhood. So I don't really know that I have any stories at all, except that I know he went to school. He mentioned that. And, of course, he mentioned some of the things that he learned in school. And I've already told you about some of the poems that he learned.
Tell us about the poems.
Well, he... and I may say something more about that later, little poems that would mean something. Like if we children would get upset about something, if I'd get upset, he'd say, "It's easy enough to be pleasant when life goes along like a song, but the boy worthwhile is a boy with a smile when everything goes dead wrong." So they were the poems that he would recite that had a meaning and that would teach us a lesson. All that you do, do with your might. Things done by halves are never done right. That was one of them. So he learned them through the McGuffey Reader. Those were prominent readers back, 1900 or before that. And everybody had to learn their reading and those things from the McGuffey Reader. Well, farming was obviously in those days a full-time job, and even more than a full-time job. Really would work from morning till night, and then even sometimes after night. The only other job that he ever had was before he got married. He tried selling insurance for a time. Of course, they were on the farm, and apparently he was able to get away from the farm a little bit, and because his father was still there, and able to do some farming. So he did try selling insurance. And I know he did that for a while, but not for very long. Well, you ask about my mother. There would be interesting stories I could tell about her. She taught school. After high school, and she graduated from Harlan High School, where ultimately I went to school, after I went to the one-room school and went to Harlan. And in 12 weeks, during the 12 weeks right after she graduated from high school, she took a post-high school course. In the following fall then, she was qualified to teach. My father got married on November the 29th, 1917, to Edna Zemer from Harlan, which wasn't too far from there. And they're getting acquainted. It was very interesting. He saw her apparently before she saw him. And the story goes, and he even told this story. This is one story that he would tell us, that he was in Harlan one day or one evening, one time, and he saw this young lady walking down the street. And he actually told a friend of his who was nearby, "That's the girl I'm going to get married. There goes my wife." That was his statement. "There goes my wife." And sure enough, he pursued her and got acquainted with her, dated her, They got married. I don't know how long it was before he got married that he saw her, but they were married then in 1917. Okay, well, about that time, like I say, by then my grandfather had moved to this house, to this place, farm east of Harlan, and my grandfather was getting older, and he wanted somebody to take over the farm. So my father took over the farm, buying it from him, of course, on installments. And so he moved onto the farm then, or my father just stayed on the farm and brought his new bride in to the farm. And so when my mother was young, just a young married lady, she not only was married, but she had her father-in-law living with us. And that was kind of a difficult thing because my grandfather never learned anything but German. And my mother didn't know anything but English. And so for them to communicate was kind of difficult. But at least, even until I was about 4 or 5 years of age, my grandfather was there living with us in that house. And so that was kind of a strain to take care of him not being able to understand. And then in those days, we didn't have any electric fans, didn't have any air conditioning, and working in the kitchen, taking care of my grandpa, she overworked, and she got what they called overheated, and it affected her heart. So when I was about 6 years old, she fell on the floor one day with a heart attack and was not able to get up. And for 6 years, my mother was sick, down in bed. For that of course, I told about farm work, but we not only worked outside, but we had to do work on the inside in the house before we'd go to school in the morning. In addition to doing some chores and then having family altar and breakfast, we had to see that the dishes were done because my mother wasn't able to do it. And so that kind of, that affected our family. And my father then had to work extra hard outside. And then in the evening he'd always fix supper, especially when the children were younger. And so it changed our home a lot because of my mother's illness. But the Lord was good then, and of course healed her when she was in her 50s, and she outlived my father by 20-some years. She lived to be 96 after all that ordeal. It was a strain because there were many times we didn't even think she'd pull through a certain day. Didn't think she'd make it till evening. And it was very, very stressful. Well, I'm sure on the inside he felt it. But he was just the type of person, like I said, his favorite verse I've learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith be content. He accepted it as something that God, like Job, that was one of his favorite stories. Job was tested, and so he was tested too, affected his family. So I think he, like I said, he would joke with people, tell funny stories and tease people. So he had a good attitude. Loved his children, loved his grandchildren. I'm sure he would have loved his great-grandchildren if he'd been around. He would have teased you, too.
But he loved to tease. He really did. He could make me cry. Couldn't he?
Yeah, I guess. Mm. This is a picture that was taken. I was born right behind this window here. This was the northeast bedroom. This was a living room window. My parents, who are back here, were married in 1917, and this was taken then probably about the following May, or maybe July. Here was a flag. It may have been Memorial Day or the 4th of July. And here is my grandpa, and these are his sons, daughters, and in-laws, and grandchildren. All of them are identified on the back of the picture if you want to know any particular person who they were. But these two here I've already pointed out are my father and my mother in 1918. I was born, they tell me, I don't remember exactly, but I remember the date they told me, that I was born, 91 years ago this month, on the 17th of January, 1921. My brother and I and my sister were all born in the old house. Like I say, that's been completely torn down and a new house built by the Amish. You can see the house here. It's about the same shape, and even the front porch is in the same location and similar. But this room here closest to us, that'd be the northeast room, was the room, I think, in which all three of us were born, I believe. But we did have a cellar behind the house where we could keep our vegetables and fruits. The barn, big barn, was way out in the back. That, of course, is gone. Over that way on the property was a chicken coop. Of course, this out here was still a cornfield. The property extended about 40 yards or 40 rods that way, about a half a mile back, and about maybe 60 rods that way. We had 60 acres on the property. Now this tree, I'm sure, was here when I was here, but it's a lot bigger, and this tree here is here, I think, too.
Do you remember playing in that big tree?
Yeah, I do. Well, we'd climb. We had lots of places to climb. We'd climb in the barn, up in the mow, and climb up on the roof, and climb in the tree. That's true. Did crazy things. Well, we grew a number of crops. The basics in those days were corn, wheat, oats, hay. I would say those were the four basic crops that most farmers raised, and those were the ones that we raised. During the Depression, and of course, if you stop to figure, I was born in 1921, and then the Depression came along at about 29 or 30, and by that time, prices were very, very low. You could get almost nothing for corn, or wheat, or oats, or even meat products we had animals too. You could sell pigs, you could get very little out of them, cows, very little out of them. And that was a time then he switched over and started raising crops that were more labor intensive, but would be a little more profitable. That's when we started raising sugar beets and tomatoes. Sugar beets seeds were not like corn. If you plant a kernel of corn, you get one stalk. If you plant a kernel of wheat, you get one stalk. But if you planted, in those days at least until it was changed, if you planted one seed of sugar beets, you'd get five or six plants, maybe 3 or 4 at least. That's the reason you'd have to thin those with your left hand and leave only one stalk or one plant in a place, otherwise they wouldn't produce very much. So that was what was involved in what we called blocking sugar beets. That's what it meant, blocking them. I don't know where the term came from, but that was a term that was used. And then in the fall, we'd go along with, they call it a lifter, kind of a inverted V that would go under the ground, and horse-drawn implement, and that would kind of lift the sugar beets enough so that the roots would be broken. And then I would take, we would take something like this. Well, it was this. This is a thing that I used many times. This is called a topping knife. After the beets were lifted up, of course, all you'd have to do then is hit the top of the beet with this hook, and then that would bring it up to your hand, and you'd grab the root and then chop off the top. Well, topping the beets then would mean you'd snag a beet, grab it, cut it off, throw it in the pile. Snag a beet, grab it, cut it off, and throw it in the pile. Then, of course, those beets, the pile of beets would be picked up by a wagon or a truck and taken down to Paulding, Ohio, where they had a sugar beet factory, they called it. So that was what was involved in raising sugar beets. Generally, it was just a family. With us, it was for many years. I do remember, though, that after we boys left and went to college, my father had to hire a lot of this done. Sugar beets especially. He couldn't do it all himself. He hired beet hunkies, they called them. They were Bulgarians that would come, and remember these guys, they would come. I don't know what happened to their wives. Maybe they never got married. In fact, my father asked one time one of these beet hunkies, who does the cooking? Oh, he says, I cook myself and I eat myself, he said. So he hired, and I think many Mexicans came then and helped pick the tomatoes. That was their specialty. You mentioned about what we would do with the tomatoes. We sold our tomatoes to two different companies. For, I remember, 2 or 3 years at least, we sold them to Campbell Soup Company. And about everybody has heard of Campbell Soup. And then some of them later, I recall, we sold to Monarch Finer Foods. And they, as I recall, made ketchup. That was their primary product. So we replenished the soup supply and the ketchup supply from our tomatoes. We had a wagon with sides, and when we'd bring the tomatoes in after they were picked, and of course picking tomatoes was a back-breaking job too. Nothing I actually liked, but we learned to do it. And we'd bring them in hampers and pour them on the wagon whenever we brought them in. And I'll have to confess that many times when we'd take that wagon down to the place where they had a pickup of those tomatoes, they already looked a lot like Campbell Soup. They were pretty soft, and I was amazed many times that they could come up with a product that was as palatable as Campbell Soup after the way they looked. And we didn't dare to pick them green. In fact, if they weren't red on the inside of the tomato, which meant that they were really ripe, they would dock us, take a whole lot less. They'd pay a whole lot less, so they had to be ripe, they had to be red on the inside, and like I say, almost soup when we sold them. It was kind of an interesting thing.
Well, we had animals too. We had horses. Did all of our farm work that time with horses. We had cows. We'd have to milk them morning and night. We had pigs, and pigs were hard to keep in. They'd have a way of digging under the fence and getting out. And even the cows would have a way of getting out and getting into the corn, and we'd have to, sometimes in the middle of the night, we'd hear the horses prance past the house. They had gotten out of the barn, and so they ran away. So a lot of memories like that.
We had horses. For a time we had mules as well. And so did our work with Tom and Jerry with the mules, George and Jim with the horses. First tractor, yeah, we had an old, and I don't remember, I think it was an International Harvester tractor. Didn't run too well. Then later he got a Ford tractor, which had rubber tires and much, much better. Well, I wouldn't remember my father's first car because he had when I was born or old enough to remember, he had a Model T. And then we bought another Model T, I remember. And then we went from, that's the car I learned to drive on, was a Model T. Then we got a Model A after that, and other cars after that. That was the days, like I say, when we had vacation Bible school, and my cousin usually drove the car. But my father was hoping that I was old enough, maybe, and I was about 14, I think, then, to drive by myself, maybe 13. So he said to my mother, he said, well, I'll let Ralph drive to church today and see how he does, and then maybe he can drive to Bible school. And I think I got along real well going to church. But coming back from church, there was a grade that we would go down just before we came to a sharp turn. And we had the old Model T, and I got confused, and coming down that hill, instead of putting on the brake, I pushed, there was a brake pedal, but there was also a clutch pedal. So I put in the clutch instead of the brake. Well, that didn't slow us down at all. In fact, we might have gone, so we roared down that hill and around the corner on two wheels. And that's what she's talking about. And then when we got home, my mother said, well, how did Ralph do? Oh, he did fine. I think he can drive tomorrow. Well, he knew I'd learned my lesson. And that I would never do that again in my life anymore. A lot of confidence in us. He was a type of father that would reaffirm us as children. And I can't remember how many times he would tell neighbors and friends, if it weren't for my children, how hard they worked in the beet fields and so forth, we'd never been able to pay off the mortgage. But he was just that type of person, very reaffirming.
If he cooked for you, do you remember what he cooked for you?
Yeah, he cooked, and very typically, sometimes we would have pancakes for supper. And they were not the kind of pancakes we would have. They weren't made with pancake mix. They were made with flour and water. And if you can imagine what they would have been like, they were thick, and we didn't have syrup in those days like you have now. Sometimes we'd have Caro syrup, and that would appreciate that. Then we'd have mush and milk. I don't know if you ever had mush and milk, and that wasn't the most palatable to us. The things that we liked the most, though, after we'd have mush and milk for supper, we'd have leftover mush, and then he'd fry that mush. And then fried mush I liked, and put syrup on that. That was super good. And then sometimes we'd have eggs. He'd fry eggs, and I always loved eggs. We'd usually have sausage around because we'd butcher, and we'd have meat, and he'd fix a lot of sausage and stuff like that.
What about, were there foods that he liked especially that you recall?
Swiss cheese. He even liked Limburger cheese. You ever hear of Limburger cheese? He even liked that. But Swiss cheese was probably his favorite food.
He loved cheese. And so, when Roy was about 9 months old, he fed him Limburger cheese. And I was just horrified. Here Roy was still, really little, and I was just, how could you do that? But real Ringenberg had to learn to like cheese.
I told you that during the Depression, pigs brought very little on the market, cows brought very little on the market. So I don't think I brought this up in the interview before, that we spent a lot of time in the wintertime butchering hogs. And then after we'd butcher, we'd make sausage, and a stuffed sausage. And my father would go into Fort Wayne, and he had a couple sisters there that would buy sausage, and then they'd tell their neighbors that their brother was going to come in, and so there were various people that were kind of regular customers. So I can remember going into town and selling sausage at 9 cents a pound, making money at 9 cents a pound. Can you believe making money at 9 cents a pound? But hogs on the foot were less than 2 cents a pound, so we'd make a little money that way. That's what you had in mind, I guess. We lived better than many people that lived elsewhere. Were out of work because of the Depression. Many people had to work at WPA. Many people didn't have a job at those days, and there was a lot of suffering. A lot of people would go hungry. But my father would often Thank God we've got food. We don't go hungry. And of course, as far as warmth is concerned, we'd get warm twice. We'd go out in the woods and saw down trees, and then we'd come back and get warm again. Well, 3 times. Warm again when we'd split the wood and saw the wood, and then warm again when we'd put it in the fire. So we had heat, we had light, we had kerosene lamps. Of course, we'd have to buy kerosene. But we had the necessities of life, and some people did not. You mentioned about electricity. Yeah, until I was about 14 or 15, maybe 16, we didn't have electricity on the farm. Very few farmers did. And then they had this special government program that involved electrifying the rural. They call it rural electrification. So by the time I was about 16, then we got electricity.
What was it? Do you remember what it was like to get electricity?
Oh, it was a great day. We just flip a switch and the light would go on. You know, that was wonderful. Get a refrigerator and have cold milk in the summertime. I often longed so much if I could just have some cold milk in the summertime. Well, I couldn't because we didn't have a way of cooling it. Yeah, I remember radio. We had something that you probably never even heard of. Did you ever hear of a crystal set? Crystal set. We learned how to bought a crystal, and then I don't remember exactly how we did it, but I used to listen to Babe Ruth baseball games on a crystal set when I was just a small boy. And then, of course, from crystal sets, which cost very little, didn't cost much, and we bought a radio. We had, even before electricity, though, we did have a radio because you could buy them battery operated. And, of course, after electricity, why we had electrical operated radios. Well, I wish I could tell you more of the details. I just know that it was a very simple thing that had a few wires and had a crystal set, and if you put those wires on the set and wired them up just right, well, you could get the different stations or get 3 or 4 different stations and listen to New York Yankees play baseball. Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth, those were my favorites back then. My father would allow us after supper to wait until Amos and Andy were off to go out and milk the cows. Mom and Abner the same way.
Would he listen to the radio as well?
Yeah, he did. He not probably as much as we did, but he loved Amos and Andy and Mom and Abner. My father loved music. In fact, we had a quintet that would come to our area every once in a while from Cleveland. They called it Cleveland Colored Quintet. And whenever my father would hear that they were in the area, he would want to go hear them. In fact, I've got a recording downstairs, but I don't have anything to play it on. It's an old disc. I have a Cleveland Colored Quintet and some of the songs that they've sung. So he loved music. Well, I would have to say that he had very, very little spare time. And my father liked to read. We didn't have a lot of reading stuff, but he would spend a lot of time reading his Bible. I can remember that after the day was over and the chores were done and he had time in the evening to sit down, he'd usually get out his Bible. Because he was a Sunday school teacher much of his life. And so he'd read it, of course, just to be reading it, and then read it also to study, so he'd be prepared on Sunday to teach his Sunday school class. Other than that, I don't know that he did too much of anything. We boys would like to play ball. We'd have been glad if he'd have had time to play a little ball with us. But I don't remember he did very much. He was always busy with something else. And I think he farmed till he was 65. I think that's how old he was when he retired.
And his health began to fail then?
Yeah, and then after that, he did very little of anything. He lived for another 10 years, and I know they had a garden after that. But as far as working in the fields, I don't remember that he did much of that. He may have done some. I don't remember those dates at all. Of course, he died at 76. Well, I remember that we were living in East Peoria at the time, where I was pastoring. We got a call. I knew he was bad. I knew he was ill. Got a call that he had been taken to Lutheran Hospital in Fort Wayne, so we immediately packed up and went to Fort Wayne. And I remember getting into the room. I remember talking to him. That morning I had read a verse, and I told him, we called him Papa. I don't know if I ever told you that. We called him Papa always, never Dad or anything like that. And I said, Papa, I was just reading this morning in the Bible where it says, the Lord said, my presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. And I said, that's a verse that's on my mind now. And I think actually after we got to the hospital, he only lasted about 2 hours, but we were there. I knew he was in great pain. He just had an awful lot of pain. He had heart trouble. The doctor had told him, he said, Henry, you've worked too hard. And I often wondered whether a person's heart could give out. And he said, I think your heart just gave out because you worked too hard. That was what one doctor said anyway. So that was his death. And then his funeral was, I would say, very moving. Actually, at his funeral, we learned something I hadn't even learned before about my father. I knew that he, before he was married, had gone with his older brother, his half-brother, who sold out that farm that I was told you about, and moved up to North Dakota. And he asked my father to go along on the train to take care of the cattle car, along with Jess Ringenberg, who would have been his nephew. So they went up to North Dakota, and my father stayed in North Dakota for a year. And one thing that was very interesting, of course, my father was always, when I knew him, was very spiritual. You know, he went to church, and he loved to talk about the Bible, and loved to read the Bible. We had family altar every day in our home. But I guess he lived quite a wild life when he was younger. I don't know too much about it. He said one of the things he liked to do most was fight when he was younger. I don't know how many fights he got into. But anyway, when he was up there in North Dakota, they had a series of meetings, and everybody in the community started going to those meetings. And my father got under conviction. They say he was so much under conviction that he just cried for 2 or 3 days. He just was so aware that he was a sinner. And his cousin told this at the funeral. I didn't even know it before. But then when he gave his heart to the Lord, then afterward all things changed, and he was just happy and rejoicing that things had been taken care of. And my cousin said of him, when he came back to Indiana, he came back a devoted Christian. That's what. And so that was all brought out in the funeral. You talked about the funeral. I wouldn't have known some of those things if my cousin hadn't told about that at the funeral.
What values were most important to him?
Well, honesty was one. Of course, we knew him to be honest. We knew him to be hardworking. I would say that the spiritual values were the greatest. Like I say, he read his Bible, took us to church, sent us to Bible school, and I don't know if I mentioned that Bible school in those days were 3 weeks, and we really learned the Bible. We had family altar in our home every morning. Every morning he'd take the Bible out, read the Bible, we'd pray. In fact, that's one of the reasons I have that chair out here in the kitchen. When I was just a little tyke, after I grew out of the high school, or the high chair, which we still have in the basement, I sat on that chair. But I not only sat on that chair, but I kneeled at that chair every morning as we had family altar. And so we would have family altar. And I would say the spiritual values, probably the...
He was very generous.
Very generous. He always had a positive attitude. Just let me give you one story. We were on our way to Woodburn, or to church one morning. And of course we had gravel roads and often had flat tires in the car. And I remember it was a very stormy day, so the tire was flat halfway to Graybill. We got out of the car, fixed fixed the tire, came back in. He said, "We sure know what the Apostle Paul had to go through, don't we?" Well, it was just ironic. He wouldn't complain about anything. He just make light of hardships, and he had to go through a lot of hardships, you know. Machinery would break down. That didn't bother him any. We just fix it, you know. Never bothered him. One of his favorite verses was, "I've learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content." And another thing that he would say often, and I don't very often hear people say this, he'd come in from the field at night, and at supper time he said, "Today I was meditating on a certain verse of Scripture." And I very seldom these days hear anybody say, "Today I was meditating on a certain verse of Scripture," and he'd tell us what that was. So those were characteristic stories of kind of sum up his attitude toward life.
Did he have a favorite song?
Yeah, and this was sung at his funeral. Jesus paid it all. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. And this farmer would take his dog to church every Sunday. And we got a new preacher. And they weren't sure how the new preacher would take to having a dog coming in and lying in the aisle near his master. And when the guy took his dog to church and laid there in the aisle, it was very clear that the pastor was not too happy about it. In fact, he even came down the aisle and gave the dog a kick. Of course, the dog ran out. But everybody was afraid that afterward this dog owner was really going to light into the preacher. But anyway, they all kind of watched as this farmer walked past the preacher, and the preacher didn't, or the farmer, they watched the farmer. He didn't seem at all deterred, and the farmer said, the preacher said, "You weren't angry that I kicked your dog out." "Oh, no. He said, "I wouldn't have had my dog listen to that sermon for anything in the world."